Welcome to Dental Business RX. Practice success in 30 minutes or less.
Thank you for calling ABC Dental.
If you had to pick one statistic or KPI to demonstrate your practice's health or give some insight into your practice's health, what would that be? You know, some people might say collections. Others might say new patients. I was reading an article recently where the author suggested it was average patient transaction value. And while all of those are important, I'm not saying any of those are not important, it isn't the one I would pick if you were a GP dentist and I was trying to determine whether your practice was healthy or not. As a matter of fact, the one I would pick, nobody really keeps. I was asking Sabri recently about this because she interviews a lot of our newer clients and when they first come on board. And according to her, 2% of the new clients we get can even give her a number associated with this statistic, and they don't keep it regularly. So what is this statistic? Well, if you're a GP, the stat that would tell me whether your practice is healthy or not, I mean, obviously you don't want to be not profitable and whatnot, but the stat that I would use to determine the health of your practice would actually be the number of recall patients. Now, notice I did not say the number of hygiene patients. I said the number of recall patients. And I've talked about this before on the podcast. It's been in a number of episodes we've gone over in the past. But I realized it was sandwiched in with a bunch of other things because normally I'm talking about building your hygiene department at that point, and it's one of those things where you go over 10, 20 things and there's not a lot of focus on a particular thing. So I wanted to do a little bit of a shorter episode this week just to focus on this because I would like people to start really looking at this because this is an important statistic you should be keeping in your practice. And that's what I want to talk about this week. I want to talk about, what it is, which obviously you probably figured it out, but there's a couple nuances to it, how to monitor it, and how fast it should be growing, and more importantly, why it matters to your practice. My name is Jeff Bloomberg, and I'm your host. And so let's just start off by defining this statistic, number of recall patients. Now, if you're old school like me, you may hate the word recall. I don't really have a problem with it, but back in the 90s and early 2000s, you had a lot of doctors that didn't want that word used with patients because it was associated with the car recalls. We're calling you in for a recall, like your crown didn't work or something, or you need maintenance. Whatever, call it recall, recare, checkups, whatever you want to call it. But it's number of recall patients. Just for the sake of this episode, it's number of recall patients. So what would we define as a recall patient? Well, it's simple. It's either a 6, 4, or 3-month recall. You can even count the perio maintenance in the 3-month recalls. That's basically all it is. Now, that's not everybody that's being seen on the hygiene schedule. At least 50% of practices run their new patient initials through hygiene, obviously with the doctor doing an exam. And then you probably have some type of soft tissue management program where you're doing scaling and root planings in hygiene. So those don't count towards number of recall patients. It's strictly people who are coming in for a checkup, a 3, 6, or 4-month recall appointment. And like I said, if you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you've heard this before, that this is a cool statistic you should keep or whatever. But why all the big focus? There's a reason behind this. There's a method to this. Why is it important? It's because it gives me the health of your business. It tells me how good your retention is. It tells me if you're going to be eventually growing or contracting. In business, they'd be looking at this specifically as a retention issue, or what you might hear in the business world is it gives insight into the size of your database or customer base. And in dentistry, there's the term usually, and I don't know where the term came from originally, number of active patients. To me, it's a very arbitrary term, number of active patients, meaning usually that is how many patients have been into your practice in the last 2 years, okay? But in theory, you could have seen somebody 18 months ago and they're never coming back. That would be included in the active patient count. I can see the argument behind it because if I'm buying a practice, which is usually where this becomes really important, because your active patient count is when you're buying a practice, right, or you're selling a practice. I could think, well, it's going to probably be easier for me to get somebody in who was here 2 years ago than it is for me to get somebody who has been, 5 years ago. So fine. But the fact that someone came and saw you for an emergency appointment 18 months ago and never came back, they're still counted in your active patient base, but they're not really active. A better way to determine how many patients you actually have that are truly active are people who have a next visit. That's really your active patient count. That's your database from a business world translation. That's your database, because these are people who are actually coming back. So you might have 4,000 quote unquote active patients, but only 1,300 have a next visit. What's happening with those other 2,700 other people? I said other one too many times there. Sorry, folks. But what's happening with those other 2,700 people? Well, maybe they will come in if you call them, but right now they don't have a next visit, so they're technically not active. So how quickly should this recall stat be growing, this number of recall stat be growing? Well, a lot of it depends on how many new patients you get on average per month. So let me give you some basic math, because this is what I want to focus on about this. I want you to start really looking at this as a GP, because it is a game changer. So let's say you're getting 30 new patients a month. That's your average. You saw 360 new patients last year, which a lot of people see more than that. But let's just say 30 for the sake of argument's sake, rather. 30 a month, 360 a year. All right, so let's say out of those 360 patients, what percentage would you expect to never see again? Now, whatever answer you just gave yourself may be different than the one I'm going to give you, but the average answer I hear when I'm doing this in a seminar is usually 20%. Everybody can kind of think with, yeah, I'd probably lose about 20% of the people. Okay, so you saw 360 people, or 30 a month, you lose 20%. So that means the people that are supposed to stick with the practice are 24 a month. You lose 6 and 20%. Or you saw 360 a year, you lose 20%. That leaves you with 288 patients that are going to stick with your practice out of the 360 you saw last year. Now, if we take those 288 patients and we multiply that by 2, because that's how many recalls at minimum we would expect to get out of this 288 patients. We're probably going to get more, because some of these people are going to be on 4-month recalls. Some will be on recall and perio maintenance. They're coming every 3 months. But let's just, we're going to keep this conservative. Let's say we're going to say 2. So if we take 288 people, we multiply it by 2, that means that's 576 recall visits that we potentially have generated by getting 360 new patients. So we got 360, lost 20%, left us with 288. Times 2 recalls a year, we now have 576 potential recalls for the following year. Okay, so now what does that boil down to per week? Well, if we're doing 576 a year, and let's say we work 50 weeks a year, we take 2 weeks off, that leaves us with, per week, 576 divided by 50, leaves us with basically 11 and a half. Okay, 11. It's 11.52, but I was told not to get into the super decimal points here. But say 11 and a half. So that's 11 and a half a week that we should have added if we saw 30 new patients a month last year. 360 is 11 and a half recall appointments per week in the new year. So now, if we're supposed to see 11 and a half recall appointments per week in the new year, how does that translate into hygiene days? Well, if we can assume that a hygienist is going to see 8 patients a day, which is a pretty decent average, right? Well, that essentially works out to a little over 1.4 hygiene days per week. So again, big picture, we saw 360 new patients last year. We lost 20% of them. That should translate into a day, almost a day and a half of hygiene added to our schedule in the new year. That's how that should work. Okay, so if you were seeing 4 days of hygiene last year, and that 4 days included, scaling and route plannings and new patients, well, in the new year, you should now be seeing 5.5 almost. That's how that should work. Now, ask me how many times this actually happens. Pretty close to never. You see it occasionally, especially with an active MGE client who's really got everything firing on all cylinders. But for the most part, with a newer client coming in, or you don't see this. You see hygiene stays the same. Maybe they added a half day, but they still have openings, etc. So now I want you to really confront what that means for a second. If you saw 30 new patients a month last year, or 360, and you haven't added a day and a half of recall hygiene, again, not scalings, not new patients, because obviously you got to keep getting new patients, then something is wrong. If your hygiene schedule has stayed the same, or you've only added maybe a half day of hygiene, that means you're losing patients. So really, it's one thing for me to say that, oh, you're losing patience. People can look at that and go, oh, okay, I'm losing patience. Really confront this for a minute. And I want you to confront it through the lens of the amount of work you have to put in to get a patient. Really think this through. So when you get a new patient, you pull out all the stops. This is a new patient. We want to make sure they really are happy with our practice. They get the practice tour and they meet the doctor and everybody's making sure they're well taken care of. We go through a whole thing. Maybe you spent hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to get this new patient. Maybe it's a referral from one of your really good patients. You put in some effort to get this new patient. So now you got them. You did whatever you were going to do, and then they ended up on the recall schedule, and then you never saw them again. You're actually losing people. And the silly thing about this is the amount of effort required to get a new patient versus keeping an existing patient is far, far more. For me to go get a new patient, the amount of money and time and effort I'm going to have to spend for somebody who doesn't know me from a hole in the wall versus a patient who's already been in my practice, knows me, likes the staff, to get them back is a lot easier than getting a new patient. And I'm not trying to disrespect the idea of getting new patients. You absolutely should get new patients. But shouldn't I also put the same amount, if not more attention on keeping the ones that I already have? Doesn't that make sense? Well, if your hygiene department is not growing, you're not keeping your patients. They're either not seeing a dentist at all or they are going somewhere else. That's, I guess, the point that I want to hit home here. So if you do that math that I just explained, take your number of new patients for last year, drop 20% off that number, multiply it by 2, and then figure out how many hygiene visits that'll give you how many hygiene visits for the year you should see the following year. And then you divide it by the number of weeks. That tells you how much hygiene you should be adding per week. And if you're not adding it, something is wrong. Now, why is this important? Well, let's just talk from a practice management perspective, not even a patient health perspective. But first off, the beautiful thing about the hygiene department is you're doing major work on a patient. So you do, let's say, an implant and a crown on me. How do you know I'm maintaining my oral health? Well, you're not going to know unless you actually see me. If I'm not under active treatment, what mechanism do you have to see me? You have the hygiene department. I'm more or less programmed by Crest and Colgate to show up in your office twice a year. Okay, and that's something that we just do. So when I come in, you get a chance to put eyes on me and make sure I'm maintaining my oral health. So in that sense, the hygiene department is integral to the mission of your practice if your mission is to restore health, function, and aesthetic, which, from most dentists it is. So if you don't have a hygiene department and you don't have me on active recall, you have no idea how I'm doing. Things could be going completely wrong with me and you would never know. Not even new problems, but am I maintaining the stuff you already fixed? So that's the first thing from a health perspective. From a business perspective, if hygiene is continuously growing, you'll have a good flow of patients. Now, if you give me 2 practices to fix and you ask me which one is easier, let's say I have a doctor and they're very good at sales, but they have no patients. That's scenario 1. Or I have a doctor who is not great at sales, but they have a huge amount of patient flow. Which scenario is easier and quicker to fix? Scenario 2. If I take a doctor who has a lot of patient flow, hygiene's just, blowing up, there's people coming in left, right, and center, but they're not very good at selling, I can fix that in a week. If I have a doctor who can sell, but there's nobody coming in, that takes time. We need to get on the phones. We need to go find people. We need to get people in the door. We need to reactivate people. We need to get new patients. The other way, you already have the patients coming in. But this also answers the buck, and you may have heard me say this before, where if you don't really have active work going on to keep your patients, coming in regularly, your hygiene department would devolve to just the people who are really, really, really motivated to come in and see hygiene. Sort of the upper crust of your patient base. And let's define this upper crust for a second. It's not necessarily people who are the nicest. It's not necessarily people who have the most money. It's the people who have the most attention on their oral health. That might be the top 1 out of 5 patients. And these are the patients who, if you canceled them because you had to take off a day or there was weather or something like this, and you didn't reschedule them for their hygiene visit, they would chase your front desk to get scheduled. That's probably like 1 out of 5 of your patients. What about the rest? Well, some might be bad news and you don't want them back, but the majority are going to be somewhere in between. where you cancel me because it snows, so we couldn't come into the practice today, or there was ice, and then you don't reschedule me, and now you got to chase me because I'm busy and I got a lot going on. Doesn't make me a bad person. Doesn't mean I don't care about my teeth. I just don't put as much importance on it as those your upper crust of patients who are chasing you to take care of them. Well, if you put zero attention on your hygiene department or on this statistic, number of recall patients, well, then what's going to happen is the only patients that are going to show up regularly are the ones that already did all the work you told them to do, because they have a lot, they're really fixated on it. So I came in, I needed an implant, I needed a crown, I needed a this, I got it done, you put me on recall, I show up regularly. Well, when you come for my checkup during my recall appointment, what do I have going on? Nothing. So there's not, I don't need any treatment. Well, if you don't actively work your hygiene department, that is what your hygiene department's going to become. So you look at your schedule for the day and you take a look at, where your treatment opportunity is going to come from. Well, not from me, because you already did all the work you're supposed to do. So you're thinking, okay, the only place I can get it is from new patients. No, it's from all the patients you aren't keeping on the schedule. I've said this before, compare your incomplete treatment list. Take your incomplete treatment list and look at how many of those folks have a next visit. You're going to find the numbers to be small. And it doesn't mean they're bad people. It doesn't mean they don't care about their teeth. It just means no one is actively pursuing these folks to keep them on the schedule. So when we get back to this number of recall patients, right? How do we monitor this? Well, you take a look at the schedule and you look at anybody who's a true recall, 3, 6, or 4 month, and you count the number you saw that week. That might be 30, that might be 20. And you can count it week to week. You can also count it month to month. And that number, technically, if you were to look at it over the course of weeks or months, should be growing because you're continuously adding people to the practice. If that number is not growing, something is wrong and you are losing people from the practice. And it doesn't mean necessarily, when I say losing people, doesn't mean maybe I've been in for let's say a checkup for 1.5 years. Doesn't mean that if you were to stop me on the street and say, hey, Jeff, who's your dentist? That I wouldn't say you. I probably would. But I'm not showing up. If you leave me in that condition long enough, eventually I'm going to go somewhere else. Maybe I end up with a toothache and you're not open. So I go somewhere else and I hit it off with the new guy or girl, and then I'm just not coming back. So you want to make sure you spend all this effort getting patients in the door. You want to make sure that you keep them in the door. So please, start keeping this statistic, number of recall patients. Keep it weekly, keep it monthly. And I also invite you to do another exercise, which is do the math that I did at the beginning of this episode. Look at how many new patients you got last year, whatever that number might be. Subtract 20%, then multiply it by 2, and divide it by the number of weeks you work per year. Then you're going to have how many hygiene appointments or recall appointments you should have added a week in your practice. You could then divide it by 8 to determine how many days of hygiene. And if you haven't done it, that means you're not retaining patients. So ultimately, what would I do? I think, normally when you're trying to fix a problem, the first thing you want to do is create an awareness of the problem, right? Like, let's say, for instance, and this is completely disrelated, it was the quickest thing I could think of. Let's say I was really bad at communicating and I communicated over people continuously. Someone would start talking and I would just butt in. I wouldn't let them talk. And someone pulls me aside and says, hey, Jeff, you really need to work on your communication. You keep cutting off other people's communication and it makes them irritated. Maybe they said it to me nicely. Don't call me a jerk or something. Because maybe I'm not doing it out of malice. They just tell me. And then I look at it and I go, gosh, you're right. Now, do I still do it? Sure, I might do it from time to time because it's a bad habit. But I'm now aware of it and I'm trying to control it. So the first step to solving a problem usually is awareness, okay? Aware that you actually have a problem. So I would start there. Start keeping this stat, number of recall patients. Look at how many days of hygiene you should have added, or you should add technically, because we're in the beginning of the year, in 2025, and see if you're keeping up. Now, if you are, well done. Well done. If you're not, and you need to work on your hygiene area, well, a couple things. First thing is you're going to want to not only make sure that you're keeping the patients that you're getting, the new ones you're getting now, you might have to dig through your past patients and get a lot of those folks called in and reactivated. It might take a lot more effort than you might think. I talk about this in other episodes. I do it a lot. There was a more recent one called A Definitive Guide to Patient Reactivation. It's episode number 167. I also have episodes 45 and 46. I did this a while back called Getting Serious About Your Hygiene Department. And I think the first episode I did on this was episode number 11 on retention. You can also, we have a lot of information on our online platform about how to do this on DDS Success. We'll put a link to it on the episode webpage. We also talk about it at the MGE scheduling seminar. If you want to check that out as well, I'll put a link on the episode webpage. But that's where I would start. Start keeping the statistic, look at how many hygiene patients you should have added this year or should add this year, and see where you stand. Because if you have a problem, the first thing to do is become aware of it, and then you can start doing something about it. And then all of a sudden, your practice becomes a lot easier to run because you have flow, patient flow coming into it on top of your new patient flow. And most importantly, the first step to maintaining your patient's health is getting them to show up. Anyway, shorter episode this week. I wanted to just focus on this one thing. I do hope this helps. If you have any questions or want to find out more about MGE, you can find us online at mgeonline.com or call us at 800-640-1140. I have those links on the episode webpage. Otherwise, folks, have a great week, and we'll see you at the next episode.